Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So today we're talking about a case that I remember first looking into a year ago, maybe a little bit more than a year ago. I became interested in it and I looked into it a little bit and I was going to do a video, but I was just starting out doing true crime videos on my channel and I felt like it was a big undertaking. I wasn't really doing multiple part videos at that time. They were still long videos, but they were usually just one or two parts. So for this case, I really wanted to have my research pants on and get in deep. If you've ever seen the movie Heavenly Creatures by Peter Jackson, that movie was based off of this case. I believe it was Kate Winslet's first serious big movie that she was in. There's another actress in there named Melanie Linsky. She's an actress from New Zealand, and this case happened in New Zealand. It was a very good movie. I think for the most part true to what actually happened. The details were pretty much spot on. Peter Jackson did a very good job with it. I just want to do a quick shout out to Audible. Audible is the sponsor for this video. Audible is an amazing tool, especially for me to use. I actually used Audible to research this case when I downloaded the book Anne Perry, The Murder of the Century by Peter Graham. It's an amazing book. I think probably one of the best books written on this case. If you guys are interested and you want to try out Audible, there's a link in the description box. You can get this book for your free book because Audible is going to give you a book for free, and it's just a good service to use. I'm able to listen to it in my headphones while I walk around and do other things, but I can still research. I don't have to sit down and actually physically open a book and go through it to find all the things that I want. So Audible's awesome. There's over 140,000 titles to choose from. Anything you could possibly want: autobiographies, fiction, nonfiction, historical books, mystery books, romance books. They have it all. So go ahead and check it out. There's a link in the description box if you're interested. And I want to give a quick birthday shout out to some of my Patreons who are celebrating their birthday around this time of the month. First, I want to give a shout out to Megan, who turned 21 years old on June 3rd. And the only reason I wasn't able to shout her out in that video at that time was because she didn't give me her birthday till after, but I still wanted to make sure that she was recognized. 21 is an awesome time. I remember my 21st birthday. It was fun. We have 3 birthdays on June 12th. Daphne DeWyatt, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Candy Wagner-Hiles, and Emma Milbourne, all born on June 12th. Laura Paquette and Dwa Joman celebrated their birthdays on June 11th. I hope I pronounced your guys' name right. If I didn't, just send me a message in Patreon and give me the correct pronunciations. Noel Jordan and Tiffany DeHart celebrated their birthdays on June 18th. Frank Insjersey celebrated his birthday on June 22nd. Anissa Yanke's birthday is coming up on June 25th. Julie Bryan is going to be celebrating her birthday on June 27th, and Lauren is going to be celebrating her birthday on June 28th. June was a big month for birthdays in my Patreon, I guess. So happy birthday to all the June babies. Happy birthday to all you guys out there who are subscribed to me. I don't know everybody's birthday, but if you are born in the month of June, happy birthday. I love you guys so much. Thank you all so much for being here. So let's get right into the case then. This is about the murder of Honora Parker by her daughter, Pauline Parker, and her daughter's friend, Juliet Hulme. Now, in this video, for the most part, we are going to refer to Pauline as Pauline Reaper, because that was her name for the majority of her life. You know, as long as she had lived, as far as this case goes, she thought that her last name was Reaper, until she discovered, upon her arrest, that her last name was actually Parker. So there's a big scandal, I guess, there, even though I don't think there should be. And, you know, a bunch of stuff happened where she discovered she was not a Reaper, but a Parker. We'll get there. We'll get into that. On the day of June 22nd, 1954, the afternoon quiet of Victoria Park in Christchurch, New Zealand was shattered by the screams of 2 teenage girls. Agnes Ritchie, owner of the Victoria Park Tea House, witnessed the 2 girls running towards her, covered in blood, ranting that there had been an accident and that Mother was terribly hurt. Mother was dead. These 2 girls were Juliet Hulme and Pauline Parker, and they would later become notorious throughout New Zealand and the world for brutally murdering Honora Parker, Pauline's mother. But how did something like this happen? What would cause 2 girls, 15 and 16, to brutally murder a woman, not a stranger, somebody that they knew, somebody that they allegedly loved and cared about, and who loved and cared about them? As always on this channel, we're going to get into the backgrounds, into the personalities, into the girls' interactions with each other as well as others, the factors that brought them along the path that ended up with them going to prison for murder. In order to understand the why of these horrible crimes that we talk about, we have to go back to the beginning. Juliet Marion Hulme was born in Greenwich, London on October 28, 1908. Her father was Henry Ransford Hulme, and he was born in 1908 in Almskirk, located 20 miles north of Liverpool. Henry Hulme was born into a comfortable middle-class family. His father owned a manufacturing and distributing company. They were well off. They had enough money and they were comfortable enough where Henry's mother was able to stay home and be a mother and a homemaker and a wife. It was discovered from a young age that Henry was incredibly intelligent, and he won a scholarship to Manchester Grammar School. It's literally, why is the bird sitting directly outside of my window and singing to me? I mean, it's cute. I feel like Cinderella a little bit, like they're gonna come in and land on my hand and they're gonna help me fold the laundry, but it's a little interruptive to the video. Manchester Grammar School. I can't take it. Manchester Grammar School was and is still today a very prestigious establishment. It was founded during the reign of Henry VIII. From there, Henry Hulme went on to have a very illustrious life and career. He studied math and physics at Gonville and Caius College, a constituent college of Cambridge University, and he graduated with honors in 1929. He was elected to the Isaac Newton Studentship in Astronomy with a particular interest in quantum mechanics, which at that time was revolutionary science. After he got his PhD in 1932, he studied in Germany under Werner Heisenberg, who had just won the Nobel Peace Prize that same year for inventing quantum physics. And if you're a Breaking Bad fan, Werner Heisenberg was also the inspiration for Walter White's alter ego, simply called Heisenberg. After this, he returned to Cambridge, where he was given a fellowship at his alma mater, Gonville and Caius. There, he lectured in mathematics and he studied quantum theory. In 1936, he was given a position at the University of Liverpool, and it was there that he met the woman who would become his wife, Hilda Reevely. Hilda was 3 years his junior, and although she herself was not of noble birth, it was said that she had ancestors who were, although her connection with them was very distant and many times removed. Her own father was a minister, and his father had been a coal miner. Even so, Hilda was described as a very beautiful woman with great class who thought incredibly highly of herself. She possessed a self-confident quality, and she spoke in a very polished, cut glass accent. Cut glass is used to describe an accent where words are pronounced very clearly and carefully, can also be known as a plumey accent. It was a good thing that Henry was a very important person and he was often out of town or at work, because anybody who knew the couple separately or together couldn't really understand how they had ended up becoming married. Henry was accomplished and he was very handsome in a stately, reserved kind of way, but he was reserved. He was introverted. He was an intellectual. He didn't have time for parties or get-togethers. And Hilda, she was a socialite. She loved going out, meeting people, being admired by them because she was often very admired by many men. She just liked being seen. And I think that she married him because of his social status, knowing it would gain her entry to these places. But he was kind of boring. He didn't really want to go to these parties, and he didn't really want to stay once he got there. And he didn't really want to associate with people or socialize once he was there, and she was a little butterfly flitting all over the room. Like I said, she was a very attractive woman. She was described as oozing sexuality and sensuality. Essentially, she was a shameless flirt and would become more so of one as the years went on. Henry was presented with the opportunity to become chief assistant to the Astronomer Royal. This would mean a move from Liverpool to London, which Hilda was ecstatic about because, London was the epicenter if you wanted to be a socialite, and, the who's who lived there. Everybody who was anybody lived in London, so she was pretty pumped about this move. But just before they left for London, Hilda found out something that I'm sure she was less excited about. She was pregnant with their first child. They moved into a home at 79 Foyle Road in the Maze Hill district of Greenwich, a short walk from the observatory where Henry would be working. Dr. Hulme was 30 at the time, ambitious with an analytical mind, and he started immediately on a spectral stars study. However, World War II was on the horizon, and it would change the lives and the fates of the Hulme family, as well as so many others. The same month that Juliet was born, October 1938, tensions were running high with Germany, and there was talk that there might be some enemy attacks, so they were preparing for air raids. Millions of gas masks were handed out during this time. In preparation, the Hulmes purchased an Anderson shelter. An Anderson shelter was a 6-foot-high, 4.5-foot-wide structure built out of corrugated steel that was meant to be buried 4 feet into the ground to protect its occupants from potential airstrikes. These shelters were issued to any households that made less than £5 a week, but the Hulmes were at that time a well-off family, so Dr. Hulme paid £6 and 14 shillings for their shelter. It's so funny because obviously I'm not from the UK, so I had to look up what an Anderson shelter was, and it appears that with a lot of families, after the war, because the Anderson shelter was already buried in kind of almost a permanent structure, some people still have these in their backyards, and people planted flowers on them, and they tried to make them look pretty. And in some pictures I saw, a lot of them look really cool. And although I don't envy the people who had to live through that time, I think it would be so cool and so historically nerdy to have an Anderson shelter in your backyard. So if I have any people here from the UK who have these in their backyard, can you send me pictures, please, and tell me stories? Because I would just completely history nerd fangirl out about it, and I'm just really interested in that kind of thing. I love World War II. It was my favorite war. The Civil War comes in a really close second. But World War II, I'd always studied and known a lot about it, or I thought I knew a lot about it, but I never knew, about the Anderson shelters. So it was just an interesting thing for me to look into and learn more about while I was researching this case. Sorry for the tangent. I'm not sure how to put this nicely, but Hilda Hulme did not take naturally to becoming a mother. She wasn't very maternal. She wasn't very warm, at least to children. She was incredibly warm and friendly towards other men, but she really didn't have any interest in being like a hands-on parent. She was the kind of parent who would hire a nanny who would basically move in and take care of the child. But because of the times, this was right around the time when World War II was breaking out, that kind of live-in help wasn't really accessible. So she kind of had to take care of Juliet on her own, I guess, if you can call it that, because she was so hands-off. She didn't think that children should be needy or want that much attention. She didn't think that they should make a big fuss, and she didn't think you should make a big fuss over them. So imagine a very young Juliet as a baby, 6 months old, 7 months old, crying in her crib, wanting to be held, wanting to be taken care of, and Hilda Hulme's pretty much like, oh, this baby, it just wants so much attention. I can't even. She needs to learn not to want me so much. Now I'm going to go off on another quick little tangent that's historical and psychological based, because it's so much different now to be a parent. We are so much more hands-on, and we know now, because of psychology and because of science, that children benefit and thrive more when they're given love and attention. In fact, withholding love and attention from them when they're very small can cause long-lasting psychological effects. Now, Hilda was of that mindset, right, that you shouldn't give a baby too much attention. And that was kind of common, I guess, for the times. I don't want to judge her too harshly, or have you guys judge her too harshly. I mean, in 1944, psychologist B.F. Skinner created what was called an air crib. And although it sounds lovely, it was actually awful. It was just horrible. I can't believe that something like this was actually invented and used. Basically, he invented it because he had already had one child, and when he and his wife were expecting their second child, he was like, ugh, being a parent is hard. I'm gonna make this, basically this climate-controlled box to put the baby in, and it's gonna make things so much easier for us as parents, and obviously it's what's best for the child, right? So the Skinner air crib, it was basically an oversized metal crib. It had a ceiling, 3 solid walls, and a safety glass pane at the front, which could be lowered to move the baby in and out of the crib. Canvas was stretched to create a floor, and sheeting was to be rolled on top of the canvas and could easily be rolled off from the outside when soiled. Parents could regulate the temperature and humidity of the crib via a control box on the top of the crib, and clean air was filtered into the crib from below. The crib was also higher than other cribs of the day, allowing easier access to the child without the burden of stooping over. So if I can find it, I'll link it, but there's a Ladies' Home Journal article that I think was published in the 1940s after this air crib came out, and it's titled Baby in a Box. So if you read it, you'll pretty much see how people viewed the crib, that it wasn't really a great place to put your baby, that you should be holding your baby and changing your baby with your own hands. Literally, this thing had like a roll of paper in it. So if the baby peed or pooped, you would just like roll the paper away. It's absolutely insane, like a hamster. The babies were like hamsters. But anyways, I'm sorry for that tangent. Again, look more into the air crib if you want. I would love to do videos where we talk about crazy things like this in history and psychology and stuff. If you're interested, let me know and I can do them, but baby in a box. Hilda would have liked to put her baby in an air crib like this and leave her there far before this air crib was ever invented. I have a sneaking suspicion that Juliet as a baby cramped Hilda's style, stopped her from being the social butterfly she wanted to be. All her friends were volunteering for the war effort, knitting mittens or getting stuff together for a collection. That was the social thing to do at that time. Henry was always working or out of town. That would have been her social interaction, and she couldn't really do that with a baby. So in my opinion, Hilda pretty much wished that she wasn't a mother from the moment she became one. In my opinion, don't come for me. On September 3rd, 1939, a month before Juliet turned 1, war was declared, and Henry was loaned out from the observatory to the British government to help on the mine design project. So he was actually in charge of the mine degrousing unit, and essentially what this means was there was a big issue with British ships being sunk because of enemy mines up and down the coast. These mines were almost like magnetic, and they'd be activated by a passing ship. So as a ship passed, it would activate the mine would explode, the ship would sink. It's a big problem for the British government. So Henry was put in charge of designing technology that could be placed onto the British ships, which would basically keep them safe from these magnetic mines, and he did very successfully, actually. As a result, he was often called away from London, but he knew Juliet and Hilda, they'd be okay. At least they had the Anderson shelter. They had someplace to go if there was an air raid or an attack of some kind, which inevitably did happen. On September 7th, 1940, 350 German bombers began to relentlessly drop bombs on London and the surrounding areas. The Blitz had begun and would continue day and night for 9 months straight. Juliet was 2 at the time. And of course, at this point, children were being shuttled out of London to get them away from the bombs. This was really bad. Not only were the bombs dropping bad, but there was constant bomb dust and dirt flying around in the air. Everything was just destroyed. It wasn't a great place for kids to be, but Hilda, she didn't want to leave London. Although there was arrangements made for families who were less well off for the children to be taken and, put with other families someplace outside of London. The families who were more well off and had money, they were expected to make these arrangements on their own. And it's kind of a mystery as to where Juliet was during the 9 months of these bombings. It is understood that she was probably sent out of London to live with her grandmother for a little bit, but Hilda never did go with her. And it was common practice when small children left London that their mothers would go with them if possible to ease the whole separation, especially when they're this little, like 2 years old. But Hilda wasn't going to leave London, and even though it was being bombed, there were still things to do and places to be seen, especially if you were helping with the war effort. You were considered an important person. It's not exactly known for certain where Juliet was during these 9 months of bombings in London, but it is suspected that she was there for a good part of it, and for the other part probably with her grandmother in the country, but Hilda never left with her. Juliet eventually did return to London. And of course, even after the Blitz, there was bombs being dropped, and it was still World War II. So it was still going on. There was constant war and fighting and bombs being dropped on and around London still. So it wasn't as if it was over. These people were still living in a wartime atmosphere. Personally, I don't think Juliet spent much time out of London during the Blitz. I think she was there for the majority of the time. I think this because the Blitz started on September, and that following winter, when it was still going on, Hilda Hulme was pregnant with her second child, a son she would name Jonathan. And she and Juliet were at their house when a pretty aggressive bombing started. So what happened was Hilda and Juliet ran from the house out to the Anderson shelter. Hilda was running ahead of Juliet, and according to some sources I've heard, she would do this in order to run to the shelter, get into the shelter, and then motion for Juliet when it was safe to get into the shelter. So Juliet would wait, and then Hilda would go in the shelter and motion for her to follow. But in my opinion, that's absolutely ridiculous. She was just running ahead, and little Juliet, who's 3 years old or whatever at this time, she's expected to just kind of follow and basically every man for yourself. Hilda's pregnant, very pregnant at this time, probably 8 months along. She runs ahead to the Anderson shelter, but she gets stuck trying to get into the Anderson shelter through the opening. So she can't get through. She can't get into the shelter. Therefore, Juliet definitely can't get into the shelter. Probably why, as a parent, you would carry your child out to the bomb shelter and make sure they get in there first before you get yourself to safety. But whatever, just my opinion. Anyways, she couldn't get in. She was stuck in the entrance. And Juliet pretty much had to lay in the snow under a bush for hours while bombs dropped around her. And not only did she develop after this what they called bomb shock, which today would just be referred to as PTSD, she woke up for months after with night terrors, screaming, absolutely terrified out of her mind. But she developed a physical illness from this. Afterwards, she was quite sick, obviously, from laying in the snow for hours, from breathing in all the bomb dust and just the gross stuff in the air. She developed pneumonia. They found shadows on both of her lungs. Now, pneumonia, we look at it in today's day as something that's easily cured, easily taken care of. But in those days, it wasn't so easily taken care of. Many people, especially children, would die from it. And in fact, even if you survived, you'd always have some kind of ailment or, side effect from that. Now, when Hilda gave birth to Juliet's little brother, Jonathan, everything seemed fine at first. They were a normal, happy family. Juliet went to visit her mother and her new little brother in the hospital. She held the baby. All of them went home together. Juliet, Hilda, baby Jonathan. But one night, Hilda felt she needed to go back to the hospital in the middle of the night. So she took the baby Jonathan and she left. She just left the house while Juliet slept. Juliet was about 5 at this time, so she would have awoken to an empty house by herself at 5. Nobody around. Nobody had left a note. Nobody had said, this is where we're going, or woken her up and said, just so you know, we're not going to be here, so don't be scared when you wake up. And this was a girl who already had severe, terrifying nightmares and already suffered with trauma from feeling unsafe, essentially. And now she would wake up and find nobody in the house, and nobody told her where they were. In my opinion, this is incredibly irresponsible, not only because you don't leave a child at that age alone, but because, like I said, these bombs were still falling all the time. And how would Hilda think that if another air raid happened while she was gone, that Juliet would know what to do or would be able to get to safety on her own? It does turn out that Hilda thought she had to go to the hospital with Jonathan because of some postpartum illnesses. We do believe at this time that she was suffering with severe postpartum depression. Juliet was not allowed to go to the hospital or see her mother or baby brother for quite a while after Hilda went in. So she was basically left, I think, with a neighbor or a friend, and she wasn't able to see her mother. I do believe this is probably when Juliet began to resent her little brother for taking away her mother, even though she didn't understand. She didn't understand, obviously, what was happening, that it wasn't Jonathan's fault. Hilda was too sick to be seen, or she didn't want her daughter to see her that way. Whatever the reason, it wasn't Jonathan's fault. But when Hilda and Jonathan did come home, Juliet had become a little bit more of a handful. And according to Hilda, she always was a handful. She was always a willful child. She was always kind of had a mind of her own, kind of sassy, very stubborn. When they got back from the hospital, she was even more so. And according to Hilda, because the doctor who had diagnosed her with pneumonia had said, it's probably not a great place to be in London during these bombings when she has problems with her lungs. You should probably send her to a warmer climate so she can recover. So little Juliet, at about 5.5 or 6, she's sent to Barbados with a nurse to recover. Really, I think it was just a reason, it was a good excuse, I guess, for Hilda to get Juliet out of her hair. This would be a lengthy separation. It would be the first very lengthy separation from her mother and her family, but it would not be the last. In June of 1944, Henry Hulme traveled to the United States in what is believed to have been a meeting in connection to the Manhattan Project at Oppenheimer's Los Alamos lab. An old school pal of Dr. Hulme's, Bill Penny, went to New Mexico in 1944 and it's pretty much accepted that Hulme went with him and that he was part of the team who helped design the first atomic bomb. So like I said in the beginning, Henry Hulme was a brilliant man. He was like a scientist, a physicist. He was incredibly intelligent and incredibly important and high up in the British government at this time. So much so that he was part of the team that worked on the Manhattan Project. So he definitely had a huge career, and I can definitely understand why he was so incredibly busy all the time. When he returned back to England, he was promoted to Director of Naval Operational Research, and he resigned from the Astronomical Society. His interest had moved closer to the Earth since the war, and the stars no longer held the same appeal. So if Hilda had thought that Juliet was short-tempered or hard to handle or willful before she was sent to Barbados, she would have a big surprise waiting for her when Juliet got back from Barbados. Hilda claimed when she got back, she was incredibly clingy and needy. This woman drives me crazy. This young child who has gone through so much trauma already, who has gone through a life-threatening illness, who you've sent away instead of going with her to Barbados and caring for her and getting her better. You sent her away with a stranger, and now she feels abandoned and she feels pushed to the side. She feels like she's a pain in your ass, which is basically how you've made her feel. So yes, when she gets back, she's going to be clingy and needy. That's the child trying to get validation from the parent that she is wanted and she is needed and she is going to be taken care of. But Hilda, of course, was like, you need to stop, girl. You're like way too thirsty right now. I don't have time for this. She wasn't hands-on. She didn't think kids should want so much attention. So, of course, Juliet did not get that attention, that love, that care that she was basically screaming for. I think it was at this point that Hilda decided it was much easier to be Juliet's mother if Juliet wasn't around. Because of the pneumonia, Juliet's lungs were very weak, and she contracted a severe case of bronchitis when she was 6. She was sent away again to live in the Bahamas, this time with, complete strangers. They were friends of her family. I guess they knew her parents, but she had never met them before in her entire life. They weren't her family, they were strangers. And it is said or rumored that this family had a young son who didn't like Juliet and would constantly kind of bully her and mess with her and even sometimes physically abuse her. But that's all like speculation and rumor. I couldn't find any proof or evidence of that anywhere. It's just something that I read. So, basically, this bronchitis was so bad, they thought she was going to die. She survived, but she was withdrawn from any schooling. She was in bed for, 2 years straight. And it was in 1947 when Dr. Hulme began to look for a different type of work. He had returned to a destroyed London, the place where he lived. Basically just the bombs had leveled it. It was not good. And he may have began to consider his work with the Manhattan Project, building a bomb that would essentially bring 1,000,000 times more damage than the ones that had fallen on London. And maybe he realized he didn't really want to be a part of that any longer. So he responded to an advertisement that was put in the paper saying Canterbury College in Christchurch, New Zealand was looking for a new rector. I guess most colleges and universities had seen a rise in admission numbers since the war had started. Ex-servicemen trying to get their education, things like that. But they decided, and from the impression I got, they basically hadn't had anybody who was taking on that position of rector. So rector would be like the director of the school, in charge of the school, the head of the school. And they didn't really have anybody who was delegated to that position. They pretty much had other people doing other things who would just kind of like separate all the workload that a rector would have to do, but it became too much and they decided they needed a designated rector. When they got Henry Hulme's resume, they were like, whoa, this guy's too good for us. Like, he's way overqualified. We need him. So they hired him. Juliet was 8 at this time. She was still living in the Bahamas, and she was sent to the Bay of Islands, which was on the north end of New Zealand, I believe, by the North Islands, to live with some more people who were strangers to her. Now, you may think that she was sent there because her family was now going to go to New Zealand, so they wanted to reunite. However, she was sent there months before Henry Hulme ever got the letter from Canterbury College giving him the position. So I definitely don't think that was their intent. I don't think they were like, let's just send her there so she's there when we get there. I think it was just like, let's just send her there because that's where people are that are willing to take her at this point. It really wasn't about reuniting, and here's why. He was offered the position in December, and he wrote back saying that he and his family were going to set sail for New Zealand in June. But they didn't. They didn't set sail for New Zealand until, I want to say, the following fall. So they were in no rush to get there. They were in no rush to reconnect the family. And if I picked up on that, I have to believe that Juliet picked up on that as well. Dr. Hulme and his family were welcomed to Christchurch with huge crowds. They were highly anticipating his arrival. You know, they were kind of like intriguing and important people from London. He was going to be the new rector. They had young children. The people of Christchurch were like excited, like celebrities were coming. At first, Hilda and Henry were in demand at every dinner party. Everybody wanted to entertain them, be friends with them, talk to them, but the novelty of that soon wore off as the people of Christchurch got to know the Hulmes. It was soon discovered that Henry had little to no interest in socializing, kind of wanted to just keep to himself, and he was, described as being just boring. He didn't really have much to talk about. Maybe he didn't think that the things he was interested in, these normal people, these non-intellectuals would understand, but he just didn't really want to talk to anybody. He was kind of boring. And Hilda, she just acted like the biggest snob. She acted self-important, superior. She was cool and distant to the other women. She lorded over them. Basically, she treated them like country bumpkins. She took every opportunity to compare New Zealand to London and then talk about how London was better. She pretty much only gave the time of day to other people who were from England or those that she considered well-traveled, well-educated, and progressive enough in their thinking to stimulate her mentally. And it didn't take long for the other women to notice the effect that Hilda had on almost every single man that crossed her path. At parties, she would ignore all the women, flirt with all the men, and just soak up every single ounce of flattery and attention that she could get that she wasn't getting at home. She hadn't been in Christchurch long before she was carrying on multiple affairs. She was described by men who knew her at that time as having a siren-like presence. And pretty much everybody knew it was happening, which made it a big joke when she became a founding member of the Christchurch Marriage Guidance Council. A huge irony that was lost on nobody. Juliet did not have an easy transition into life at Christchurch or life with the family she'd been apart from for so long. Her mother, father, and brother had shared experiences and events she had not been a part of. They had developed a dynamic that was different from the one she'd left, and she just didn't know where she fit in. But she had grown into a beautiful, sophisticated for her age young woman, full of a class and grace she had gained from being well-traveled and living in different cultures with different people. She was tall and blonde like her father, but cool and indifferent like her mother. Hilda Hulme would later state that Juliet had always been imaginative to a fault, which is a ridiculous statement to make. I think especially children who are young, 5, 6, 7, 8, an imagination is an amazing thing to have, and it shows actually good cognitive development. But Hilda, imagination, so much attention needed. Juliet lived in this imaginary world that she created, most likely to escape the harsh reality of the one she actually occupied. She didn't feel like she belonged in her family. She most likely had severe abandonment issues, and so she created a world with characters in it that became her friends and that she came to know better than the people in her real life. This was not something that was encouraged by her parents, but they definitely didn't have the time to discourage it either. They kind of were like, well, we think it's weird, but whatever kind of keeps her busy and happy. I mean, they realized it was going on. They wrinkled their noses at it, but let's be honest, there was no real parenting going on in the Hulme household. The maid of the Hulmes thought that Juliet was just an atrocious child, basically, like spoiled, threw fits if she didn't get her own way, just kind of self-important, as we've already said. It reminds me of Mary from The Secret Garden, where she would basically, talk to the servants as if she was the lady of the house or if she was an adult. I kind of get that impression from Juliet. And a friend of Hilda's, who's named Nancy Sutherland, remembers that Juliet was always acting things out and making these plays based on the stories she'd written. And if she was forced to play with her brother Jonathan, which she didn't like to do because she didn't really like Jonathan, she would always make him be a part in these plays with her. That's how they would play together. And he was always given a lower role or a lower station in these plays, like a submissive role, a servant, for example. She was 10 when she was enrolled at St. Margaret's Junior College, which was where most of the daughters of important men in Christchurch were educated at that time. But I suspect that having their daughter gone out of the household for the better part of 5 years, and then suddenly having her there and having her be, so imaginative and just acting up all the time, that was probably as hard of a transition for Dr. and Mrs. Hulme as it was for Juliet. So it wasn't long before they shipped her off to boarding school. This time she was sent away to Queenswood Boarding School on the North Island. If she wanted to visit home for holidays or for any reason at all, she'd have to take an overnight ferry and travel 6 hours on a train alone. So this is ridiculous to me. It's like there's many other schools and education options that are closer to home, but you're going to send your young daughter, a 10-year-old, to a boarding school in which she has to literally jump through hoops in order to come home and visit. Once again, I think it would be pretty clear to Juliet and anybody who saw what was happening that they wanted to make it as difficult as possible for her to be there with them. So it's safe to say that, coupled with what happened to her during the Blitz on London, coupled with the fact that her family continually shipped her off and abandoned her at every chance they could, find, she probably felt cast to the side, unwanted. And it probably instilled in her this very unsafe, unsettled feeling that never went away. She had been to 10 different schools in her lifetime. She'd never been able to really make friends. She was alone, bottom line. And yeah, she did create a world and a cast of characters that were so specific and so detailed and so imaginative that they became, to her, what reality was. She didn't just have an imaginary friend, she had imaginary friends. She had imaginary subjects because she was always the princess or somebody important like that in her story. She had people who adored her in these stories because she did not feel adored in real life. In December of 1950, the Hulmes threw a Christmas party and a belated birthday party for Juliet, who had been, locked away at boarding school during her real birthday. And for this party, she didn't have any friends to invite. The only children that were there were children that were arranged to be there. Friends of the Hulmes' colleagues or, neighbors, people they knew, their children, but nobody that Juliet actually knew or cared about or played with or had a connection with. She was alone. She had no one to even show up for her at her birthday party. Not surprisingly, Juliet was not happy at this boarding school. She was eventually brought home. At this time, the Hulme family was occupying the Ilham homestead, the normal residence for the rector of Canterbury College, and Juliet attended the small school there for about 2 years, where she actually seemed to be very happy. But she was, for her age, incredibly intelligent, just like her father. And when her intelligence was tested, she scored a 170 on an IQ test. It was thought that she needed to be attending a school that would offer her more stimulation academically. So in 1952, she became a pupil at Christchurch High School, which was a public school, but a very good one. Additionally, Hilda was on the board of governors at the high school, and Dr. Hulme's office was also nearby. It would be the perfect situation for the family. In reality, this was the decision that set all future events into motion. When Juliet arrived at the school, she was kind of in high demand. She was an enigma. She was tall. She had these long legs and this beautiful blonde hair and this expression of, constant indifference and boredom. All the girls in her class, they clamored around her, trying to be her friend, but Juliet had no interest in any of them. Much like her mother, she felt superior and better to anybody else. She was polite, but dismissive. But one girl did catch her attention, and her name was Pauline Reaper. And you literally probably could not have found a girl at that school who was more different from Juliet Hulme than Pauline Reaper. She was short and sturdy. She had dark, frizzy hair that was always wild and a permanent scowl. She just always looked pissed off or unhappy about something. They call it resting bitch face now, but Pauline had it down pat long before that term was ever coined. I don't think that Pauline was hated or teased or bullied. I think she was a nonconformist who was kind of a loner, and I think pretty much the other girls just didn't understand her or were scared of her or both. She liked to be called Paul at school, and at home they called her Ivan, which was her middle name. And talking about her home life, you couldn't find a girl, once again, who was more different in background and family life than Pauline was from Juliet. Her parents were Bert and Honora Reaper, and they had an interesting story all of their own. Herbert Reaper was born in 1893 on the west coast of Tanzania. He went to New Zealand when he enlisted in 1915, and that is where he met his wife, Louisa, who was most likely a nurse at one of the base hospitals at that time. Now you'll notice I said Louisa and not Honora, because Bert Reaper, he was only married once, and it was not to Honora Reaper, it was to Louisa. Honora Parker, or Nora as she was called, came from a family that was pretty financially comfortable. But her father was admitted to an asylum at one point, where he later died at the age of 39, and his estate was liquidated to provide for the family. But for a woman like Nora's mother, who was used to living comfortably, she didn't really know how to hold on to that money, and it didn't last very long. Both Nora and Bert, because of their separate circumstances, ended up in Ratihi in New Zealand. I hope I said that right. Ratihi. Bert lived there with his wife, Louisa, who was 8 years older than him, and their 2 young sons. He worked at an accounting firm where he kept the books, and Nora also worked there, and that's where they met and they connected. He basically complained to her that he was in a miserable marriage, his wife was mean, she didn't love him, he didn't love her, and Nora, who was younger than Bert, she was 14 years younger than him and 22 years younger than his wife, Louisa. She was naive, she was a young girl, she just wanted to help. She thought that this man deserved more and better, and she was drawn to him. He was a snappy dresser. He had that allure of an older man who had kind of been around the world, been in the military, knew his stuff. So they decided that they were going to run away together. They pretty much knew they couldn't conduct an affair in Ratihi. It was a small town. It would have been a matter of time before Louisa found out. So he pretty much waited long enough to celebrate his son Ken's 14th birthday, and then he bought Nora a wedding ring in July of 1931. And then they ran off. They left. He left his family. He left his kids. He left his wife. Hide your kids, hide your wife. At first, Bert and Nora thought they were going to live this good life, right? Everything was in the past. They'd left everything behind, but everything had not left them behind. He'd abandoned his wife and his 2 children. They rented a pretty nice villa in St. Albans, but it was only a matter of time before Bert was arrested in September. Louisa was not letting him off the hook that easy. She had him arrested for failure to keep his wife and children. From that point on, they made sure any place that they rented or purchased was in Nora's name, so it would be harder to find him, I suppose, but it wasn't even Nora's name. Their property that they had in the future was under the name Honora Reaper, wife of Herbert Reaper, which we know that wasn't true because Louisa never gave him a divorce, so he was never able to legally marry Nora. As far as we know, Bert Reaper never had any contact with Louisa or his 2 sons ever again. And I'm not sure if he continued to pay support. I have a feeling, considering what happened later when Pauline was arrested, that he probably didn't. But regardless, he had no more contact with them, and he and Nora would go on to have 4 children of their own. The first was a baby boy. They called him a blue baby because he was born with health issues and he didn't survive the day. They then had a daughter named Wendy, who was a happy and healthy girl. And a little over a year later, they gave birth to Pauline Ivan Reaper on May 26, 1938. Crazy Gemini. By all accounts, Pauline also was a happy and healthy little girl until she was 5 years old. When she was 5, she developed osteomyelitis in one leg. And osteomyelitis is an inflammation of the bone marrow due to an infection. It's an extremely painful and at that time life-threatening condition for anybody to go through, much less a child at that young age. She was kept in the hospital for 8 months. At the age of 5, in the hospital for 8 months. And then she had to withstand several operations to drain the infection, 2 years of daily dressings and redressings of the leg. And after 3 years, she finally got better, but she was left with a noticeable limp and constant pain that she was prescribed painkillers for. The Reapers weren't poverty-stricken, but they certainly weren't flush. Bert worked for Dennis Brothers Fishmongers, and Nora was pretty much a housewife. She stayed home. He was the main income. But he was 54, and when talk started about him retiring, they had to figure out how they were going to make a supplemental income, which caused them to move to a house in the center of the city. It was a rundown neighborhood at this time, and there weren't a lot of kids around because families typically didn't want to raise kids in the center city. They wanted them to be on the outskirts and in the suburbs where they had a lawn to run around in and space to live in. As a result, for 2 years, Pauline was the only student in her class. There was literally no other kids. There was the daughter of a doctor who lived nearby the Reapers, but she was sent to a private school. Yeah, she was the only kid in her class. That's crazy. So it's not really a wonder how Pauline kind of grew up to prefer being alone, to keep herself occupied, and to not really want the company of other people. The main reason for the move to the city was because Bert was going to be retiring soon, and they needed to start taking in boarders, and this house had the room where they could take in boarders and make money from those boarders. The house was always shabby and just kind of haphazard. It always smelled like fish, and it was pretty clear to anybody who came there that the family had trouble making ends meet. Nora took a job working as a secretary when both Pauline and Wendy were in school, and as a result, she was always tired, always cranky, didn't really have the time to be the attentive mother that she probably wanted to be. They didn't have money for vacations, but the family would spend Sundays together. Sometimes they'd go for a drive to the beach, other times they'd go to church together. To add to the stress and uncertainty of the time, when Nora was 42, she gave birth to her last child, a little girl they called Rosemary. Rosemary was born with Down syndrome, and in those days it wasn't easily understood. It was just understood that it was a lot of work to care for these children. So Nora had to quit her job so that she could take on the added responsibility of caring for Rosemary. But eventually it became too much, and Rosemary was sent to live at Templeton Farms, an institution for intellectually challenged children. A lot of times it says Rosemary was sent there when she was 5, but from the time, if you kind of do the math, I do believe she was about 3 or 3.5 when she was sent there, which is incredibly sad. And in those days, it was common for families to use these institutions as dumping grounds for kids like this. They would just drop them off and wash their hands of them, not see them again. But to the Reapers' credit, they didn't do that. They visited Rosemary every single Sunday. They sometimes brought her home for weekends and always on holidays. Now, although Pauline didn't really get along with her older sister, Wendy, because Wendy was pretty much viewed as like the good one, so the golden child that, didn't give anyone problems, Pauline was quite fond of little Rosemary. She was good to her. She played with her. She loved her. Now, according to Herbert Reaper, until Pauline started at Christ Church High and met Juliet, she was not a problem for anybody. She was a good girl. She knew the difference between right and wrong. She could take accountability for things when she'd done anything wrong. And he never remembered her having to be disciplined physically, at least. But when she arrived at Christ Church High School in February of 1952, she already seemed to be opposed to everyone and everything. Her relationship with her mother appeared to have been broken and strained from a very early time. Honora Reaper wasn't a young woman at this point, and she was stretched very thin, especially with taking care of Rosemary and then having to send her off to Templeton Farms. Now she had to work. She had to worry always about money. She always had to worry about how they were going to eat or, taking care of the boarders. She had a lot on her plate. So she didn't really have the patience for a daughter who was in the process of discovering herself and naturally acting out in a rebellious teenage kind of way. It kind of reminds me of that movie Matilda, where Matilda's asking her parents all these questions because, that's what kids do. They ask questions. They want to learn, and they learn through asking questions. They're not trying to be annoying, but the parents are just like, oh, this Matilda, she's so annoying. Stop asking questions. Why do you want to know all this stuff? And they treat her more like a bother and a pain than a child who's just trying to learn the world. I have a feeling that's pretty much how the interaction was. I do think Nora loved her daughter. She just didn't have the time to deal with her, and she would often explode and blow up. They would fight, and then she would feel bad and have to apologize later. And I mean, who hasn't been there in both sets of shoes? When Juliet and Pauline became friends, it was because they both suffered from childhood illnesses that made them exempt from any physical activity at school. So while the other girls were running around, playing sports, or, during recess, Pauline and Juliet had to sit out, and as a result, obviously, when they're sitting on the sidelines for hours and hours, they began to talk and chat and then they became friends. They talked about what it was like to be hospitalized for extended periods of time when they were young. They talked about writing and poetry. Pauline was an artistic soul herself. She liked making these little models out of clay and plaster. She was also an avid and enthralled fan of Juliet. She was just so impressed with Juliet and everything that was Juliet. And Juliet was incredibly impressed with herself, so they had that in common. The unlikely friendship grew and strengthened until one day in June of 1952, Juliet went home and told Hilda, "Mommy, I've met someone at last who has a will as strong as my own." Juliet had this incredible imagination, and Pauline was absolutely enthralled by everything that came out of her mouth. While they sat together, they began to write stories and poems together. Juliet invited Pauline into this world she had created, and they began to create it further together. And Pauline became an almost permanent fixture at the Hulme home. At first, both sets of parents were pleased that their daughters had started what seemed to be a normal friendship. The Hulmes had been wanting Juliet to, get out of her fake world and make real friends for a while now, so that's what they wanted. And Pauline's parents were pretty much just happy that their daughter wasn't coming home in a miserable mood from school every day. But the problem with Pauline spending so much time at the Hulmes was she began to compare them to her own family and her own circumstances, which was a recipe for disaster. She pretty much adored Dr. and Mrs. Hulme almost as much as she adored Juliet. She thought Dr. Hulme was very stately and refined and intelligent. And Mrs. Hulme always looked so beautiful, was always smiling. She was never in a bad mood, and she didn't bother the girls with annoying questions about their lives. She just kind of treated them more as if they were girlfriends than children. The Hulme homestead is a beautiful piece of property, and the house had shelves and shelves of books, paintings hung on the wall. The Hulmes drank French wine out of crystal glasses. They were so sophisticated, so high class, so much better than her own parents. As a result, she became more and more of an issue at home as she resented her family and her circumstances, and really pretty much just didn't want to be there and didn't want to be a part of them. One day in August, the girls went on a normal bike ride, as they often did, and it was then that they came upon an open field. And they decided to remove most of their clothes and go running through this field. They danced around and they brought themselves to what has been called a state of ecstasy. And this feeling, this new feeling of being alive, of feeling so happy and an unbridled joy was so strong and impactful for them that they completely forgot to put their clothes back on, and they drove home on their bikes without them. Pauline claimed later that it was at this point that she and Juliet became more than friends. They developed an indissoluble bond. Pauline never wanted to leave the Hulme home. She told Hilda and Juliet she was very unhappy at home, that nobody understood her. Her mother didn't understand her. Her mother was always on her case. She would physically abuse her and punish her, and it would be so heart-wrenching to Juliet to see her friend going through something so tragic and hard that they would just sob together. They had almost become one person, experiencing each other's highs and lows. And even still at this point, Hilda Hulme didn't think that there was anything strange or overly close about their relationship. For the first few months, it was pretty normal. They did things that normal kids did. They went out and rode on Juliet's horse. Juliet owned a horse and Pauline had been taking riding lessons, so they both loved riding the horse. They loved to write and act out plays. Of course, Pauline was always given a secondary character, with Juliet being the main character. And at this point, the Hulme's maid did say that she believed Juliet was the domineering personality in the two, that she was the one who was kind of running the show, and that Pauline just so badly wanted to be like Juliet that she'd become a shadow person, basically following the leader, doing whatever Juliet did, liking whatever Juliet liked, wanting to be whatever Juliet was. But eventually, the girls became so excited with the stories and the worlds they were creating that they stopped sleeping. And I do think that this is where some of the problem started. They were literally up all night. Sometimes Pauline would sneak out and she would go to Elam, and they would spend basically the whole night out riding Juliet's horse or laying out a picnic on the yard of the Hulme home while the parents slept in the house and had no idea what was happening. They basically stay up all night. Even when they were apart, they'd stay up all night writing and just, almost manically obsessed with each other and and this world they were creating. And when you're sleep deprived for an excessive amount of time, there can be a point of almost insanity that takes over. Your brain structure actually changes, and we'll go more into that later. Now, much of what happened in these following months, we know because Pauline was keeping a diary that she'd gotten for Christmas of 1952. Her first entry was January 1st of 1953, and it was a New Year's resolution to be lenient with others. The Hulmes were spending a portion of their summer holidays, which in New Zealand happens during December and January. They were spending a portion of their summer holidays at Port Levy. Port Levy Beach is located in Canterbury. And while they were there, Pauline was basically going to a Bible school or a Bible camp sort of thing. And on one of their field trips, she spent some time at a farm where she appeared to develop a very normal flirtation with a boy. She was even jealous of another girl who she thought was kind of her competition for this boy. So it just seemed to be like they were just two normal girls separately celebrating their summer holidays. At the end of January 1953, Pauline began to write in her diary that her mother was planning on taking in a set of boarders from the local teacher's training school. It was also around this time that Dr. Hulme claims both Juliet and Pauline were getting nervous about the new school year starting, so he basically gave them some advice and calmed them down and, just that was there with that fatherly kind of like, it's gonna be all right, you girls are brilliant kind of pep talk. It seemed, from what I can gather from Pauline's diary entries, that there would be 4 boarders who would come and stay with the Reapers at that point. Their names were Harry, Ross, Ron, and John would also be known as Nicholas at times. Pauline wrote about each man's impending arrival or part of her life in her diary. On February 9th, she wrote, Harry arrived today. He seems quite nice, and he's about 35. On February 10th, she wrote, I do hope Ross turns out to be nice. I've been looking forward to his coming so much that I will probably be disappointed. And on February 18th, she wrote, Ron, the new boarder, arrived. He is quite nice and is about 25. On March 4th, she wrote, today many people came about board. We may be getting a Frenchman. I hope very much that we are. And on March 9th, she wrote, John helped me with my homework for about an hour. He says, damn a lot. I did a lot of homework. So pretty much these men, right, they're like living in her house with her. They have the meals with the family. That's how it was when you were a boarder. You would pay for your room and board, and the landlady in this case, who was Nora Reaper, would cook your meals for you and, just make sure that you were taken care of in that way. Adam Abrams, who runs a very detailed blog about this case, he theorizes that the presence of the boarders, because they were from the teacher's training school, may have increased Pauline's educational abilities at this time, because she did seem to become more of a prolific writer. She did seem to become more inventive and creative. So possibly it was the influence of both Juliet, who was incredibly brilliant, and these boarders who were training to be teachers. On March 20th, the school was taken to Lancaster Park for a sporting event, and of course Pauline and Juliet, they sat out. They found a nice shady area under some trees where they could sit together and write, and on that day, Pauline wrote a poem. Now this poem is called The Ones I Worship. I think it's a very good poem, especially considering I think she was about 14 when she wrote it, but I'm going to read it to you now, and then we'll discuss it for a second afterwards. There are living amongst 2 dutiful daughters of a man who possesses 2 beautiful daughters, the most glorious beings in creation. They'd be the pride and joy of any nation. You cannot know, nor try to guess, the sweet soothingness of their caress. The outstanding genius of this pair is understood by few, they are so rare. Compared with these 2, every man is a fool. The world is most honored that they should deign to rule. And above us these goddesses reign on high. I worship the power of these lovely 2, with that adoring love known to so few. 'Tis indeed a miracle one must feel, that 2 such heavenly creatures are real. Both sets of eyes, though different far, hold many mysteries strange. Impassively they watch the race of man decay and change. Hatred burning bright in the brown eyes, with enemies for fuel. Icy scorn glitters in the gray eyes, contemptuous and cruel. Why are men such fools they will not realize the wisdom that is hidden behind those strange eyes? And these wonderful people are you and I. Okay, so obviously this poem that Pauline wrote is about her and Juliet. And the most important thing I think to take from it are the beginning lines. They are living amongst two dutiful daughters of a man who possesses two beautiful daughters. She considered herself and Juliet to be sisters, and their father to be Henry Hulme. At this point, she was separating herself from her family, basically almost annexing herself from them. I'm not a part of you. This person is my father. This person is my sister. This is the family I choose. Additionally, at the end, or towards the end, when they talk about the two sets of eyes, hatred burning bright in the brown eyes, with enemies for fuel, Pauline's talking about her own eyes, her brown eyes. And icy scorn glitters in the gray eyes, contemptuous and cruel. She's talking about Juliet's eyes at this point. So is this out of the ordinary for a young girl to write, especially one who is deeply ingrained in the world of fantasy? I don't think so, but I think the most important thing to take away from it is that she was at this point trying to separate herself from her family as quickly and as permanently as she could, to the point where she was thinking of somebody else, another man, as her own father. And she mentions in this poem the outstanding genius of this pair. In 2 days before she wrote this poem, she made an entry in her diary which said, "We have decided how sad it is for other people that they cannot appreciate our genius." So they think, these two girls, they think they're just really so much smarter and better than everybody, that they are special, that they are almost gods among men, right? And that's going to be important in a second. They weren't private about their closeness. Everybody in the school knew that pretty much they were best friends to the exclusion of all others. They walked around the school holding hands. They kissed. They were together nonstop. And there began to be rumors that they were together in a way that was more than friends, basically, that they were having a sexual or intimate relationship. It became so well known in the school that the headmistress had to call Hilda Hulme and basically say, maybe there's something going on with these girls that's like more than friendships, basically saying they're lesbians. And Hilda wasn't bothered. Hilda was like, listen, this Pauline girl's keeping Juliet out of my hair and keeping her happy right now. So until I see something more concrete, we're all set. Thanks so much for your concern. It is possible that Juliet and Pauline shared a relationship that went further than friendship, that maybe they were in love in a way, maybe they even explored their sexuality together. This was an all-girls school, and it is said that it was not uncommon for girls to develop crushes on each other or to explore things, together sexually. However, they usually would keep that private. It wasn't really accepted at that time. But Juliet and Pauline, they were not keeping it private. They were like right out there. They wanted everybody to see and know because they considered themselves to be above, human law or human judgment. They weren't worried what other people thought about them. The Hulmes went back to Port Levy Beach for the Easter holidays, and this time Pauline came with them. This trip strengthened the bond between Juliet and Pauline, but it also strengthened the bond between Pauline and the Hulmes, or at least the perceived bond that Pauline had towards the Hulmes. See, Mrs. Hulme, Hilda Hulme, was very kind to Pauline. She almost treated her like a charity case, but she never thought that she was good enough for Juliet. She never thought that they were of the same class or of the same station. But during their time in Port Levy, Hilda would sit with the girls and she would brush Pauline's hair. And according to Pauline's diary, Hilda Hulme said, "You're my foster daughter. I wish you were my real daughter." And it's just cruel. It was a cruel thing to do for Hilda, on Hilda's part, because she just loved the attention and adoration from Pauline, just like her daughter Juliet. But as an adult, she knew that Pauline was having some serious issues with her mother. So instead of trying to repair the bond between mother and daughter, she almost made it worse. Knowingly, I think. She would rather have been the cooler mom out of the two, the one who was liked more out of the two, than to help Nora repair her relationship with her daughter. On Good Friday, April 3rd, very early in the morning before the sun came up, the girls woke up and they walked up the hill behind the cottage. They had what I guess you could call a spiritual experience. They saw this bank of clouds, basically underlit by the moon over the ocean. And as the sun came up, they had a vision. In her diary, Pauline writes, "Today, Juliet and I found the key to the fourth world. We realize now that we have had it in our possession for about 6 months, but we only realized it on the day of the death of Christ. We saw a gateway through the clouds. We sat on the edge of the path and looked down the hill out over the bay. The island looked beautiful. The sea was blue. Everything was full of peace and bliss. We then realized we had the key. We now know that we are not genii as we thought. We have an extra part of our brain which can appreciate the fourth world. Only about 10 people have it. When we die, we will go to the fourth world. But meanwhile, on 2 days every year, we may use the key and look into that beautiful world which we have been lucky enough to be allowed to know of, on this day of finding the key to the way through the clouds. By early March, Pauline was writing in her diary original poems and stories and adding those to her day-to-day entries. Pauline and Juliet had created this world together, most likely based on the characters in the world that Juliet already had created. It was the kingdom of Barovnia. But as time went on, the characters and the events in this kingdom got more violent and bloodthirsty. The girls were continuing their sleepless nights, staying up all night, writing furiously, losing themselves in this altered reality they'd created together. The fourth world, to them, according to them, was a heaven-like place. And when Pauline used the word genii, which was supposed to be the plural form of genius because they considered themselves to be geniuses, she meant they now discovered that they weren't geniuses, but they were just special. They were 2 of the 10 people in the whole world that had this special part of their brains that allowed them to know about the fourth world. To me, these were 2 teenage girls who never felt special. Even though Juliet acted as if she were superior and acted as if she were special, she never really truly felt special to anyone besides herself. But she always knew she was special, and it had never been recognized. But now, something in that universe had recognized this special quality that they both had, that they shared, and had revealed itself to them. They used movies and actors that were popular at that time because they loved the movies. They used these movies and actors in order to add more life and give themselves more ideas for these stories. James Mason was their favorite. They made these plans that one day they were going to go to Hollywood and marry James Mason. One of them would marry him. It didn't matter which one. They weren't jealous or possessive over James Mason. They would marry him. They would become friends with all his Hollywood friends, and their great stories would be turned into even greater movies. Dr. Hulme had been planning a trip to the US where he would represent Canterbury College at some sort of convention, and Hilda Hulme was to go with him because they were going to be making a trip to London back home on their way there or back. Nora Reaper had offered for Juliet to stay with the Reapers while they were gone so she wouldn't be alone, and that was great. The girls were getting very excited about it, but then Juliet got sick. She came down with tuberculosis. On May 15th, Pauline wrote in her diary, "Mrs. Hulme told me that they found out today Juliet has tuberculosis on one lung. Poor Julieta. It is only now I realize how fond I am of her. I nearly fainted when I heard. I had a terrible job not to cry. It would be wonderful if I could get tuberculosis too." On May 16th, she wrote, "I spent a wretched night. It was a relief to see Juliet looking so well. We agreed it was a great pity I had not TB too, and it would be wonderful if I could catch it. We would be in the sanatorium together and would be able to write a lot. We have decided we are the most incredible optimists." So, I mean, of course, you have a teenage daughter. She comes down with tuberculosis, which was life-threatening, a big deal. Of course, you're going to cancel your trip to the US and to London, right? They're going to be gone for 3 months. Of course you're going to cancel your trip. At least Mrs. Hulme would stay home and care for her daughter. But no, that's not what happened. Juliet was put in a sanatorium to recover, and Hilda and Dr. Hulme went on with their plans as usual. They were going to go to America, they were going to go to London, and Juliet would be fine. She's taken care of by professionals. They know what they're doing. You don't need any parental support around you when you're this sick and basically in your deathbed and in a hospital surrounded by strangers. You're going to be fine. And of course, this brought on a whole new wave of abandonment and neglect and rejection that Juliet had become also familiar with. Juliet was 14 and a half, and she wouldn't see her parents for 112 days. Hilda didn't seem to understand that her daughter felt upset by this. In fact, Hilda was annoyed that she only received 2 letters from Juliet the entire time that she was abroad. And Hilda claimed when she returned, Juliet was even more distant than usual, even more cool to her parents than usual. and that her bond and friendship with Pauline had only strengthened because Pauline had come to visit her while she was in the sanatorium. She had been there for her, and Pauline had actually had the brilliant idea that they should start writing letters to each other pretty much daily, but they would write the letters from their characters in Barovnia. They began to write to each other as Charles and Lance. Prince Charles was Juliet's character, and Lance was Pauline's character. So when Pauline would write her a letter, she'd basically write 6 pages from Lance and then 2 pages from herself, Pauline. Juliet would respond similarly with a whole bunch of pages from Prince Charles and then a couple from herself. So obviously the reason that the bond between them was strengthened was because at this point, Juliet felt, my parents abandoned me over and over again. Pauline's been the only one who's always there. She is the only one who actually cares about me and who actually loves me. In one of these letters from Lance to Prince Charles, Pauline, as Lance, writes, I don't kill people. I thought you might like to know since you asked me some time ago. My father hasn't killed anyone for a while. I would like to kill someone sometimes because I think it is an experience that is necessary to life. So it's getting intense now. They're writing letters to each other, but also from their made-up characters. And they're starting to take this very seriously. And it kind of is a symbol to me that the letters that were sent back and forth from Pauline and Juliet while Juliet was at the sanatorium were mainly from Lance and Charles. It makes me believe that this was no longer a game for them or a fun little activity. This was who they were becoming. This was who they saw themselves as. And that's why the bulk of the letter would be from this other character with only a couple of pages from the actual person. It was as if they were losing their actual selves more and more as time went on and as they became each other's only support system, only friend, only confidant. In the next video, it gets more scandalous, it gets more crazy, lots of stuff happens, lots of stuff with Hilde. Pauline has a sexual awakening when she has a relationship with somebody that is not Juliet. It gets crazy, and the two start to hatch their plan of how they're going to basically end Nora Reaper's life. Thank you guys so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it was pretty long and I went on some tirades and, some tangents, but I really enjoy the background of all these people. I enjoy seeing how they got to the point where they got. The murder obviously is interesting and scintillating and, scandalous, but there's so much other stuff in every single case that's just as interesting and scandalous and, worth talking about, I think. So let me know what you guys thought. I will see you very soon. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Bye.
She's like a sickness in my brain, a vision standing by the window pane. She ripples through the blinds and leaves me in a daze.